There was a moment in the late 1800s when flour changed. Not all at once, not with announcement, not with ceremony. It changed in mills, in factories, in the machinery that turned wheat into powder. And within a generation, nobody remembered what flour used to be. This wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was efficiency. But efficiency has consequences that unfold slowly, over decades, over bodies, over the quiet architecture of daily life. By the time anyone noticed, it was already normal. The bread had changed. The body had changed. The assumption of what food could be had changed. And none of it required permission. The transformation happened in the background of ordinary life. While people were working, raising families, building cities, the fundamental nature of their daily bread was being redesigned. Not by chefs, not by doctors, not by anyone who ate it. By engineers, by industrialists, by people solving problems of scale and profit and shelf life. And the result was a product that looked like flour, behaved like flour, and was called flour. But it was no longer the same thing. If this perspective feels different, you're not alone. Flour, before the 1870s, was not a single thing. It was stone ground. It was coarse. It varied from mill to mill, from region to region, from season to season. When wheat kernels were crushed between stones, everything stayed in the flour. The bran, the germ, the oils, the fiber. It was perishable. It had texture. It had taste. Bakers knew this. Families knew this. Flour didn't last long. It went rancid. It attracted insects. It required care. Bread made from this flour was dense. It filled the stomach differently. It took longer to chew. It sat heavier in the body. This wasn't romantic. It was simply how food worked. People didn't think of flour as nutritious or whole. They thought of it as flour. It was part of the rhythm of life. You bought it fresh. You used it quickly. You planned around its limitations. In homes, flour was stored in cool, dry places. In cities, it was purchased in small quantities. In rural areas, it was sometimes milled at home or by a neighbor. The process of making bread was longer. The dough was harder to work. The result was unpredictable. But this unpredictability was expected. Food wasn't standardized. It was local. It was variable. When someone ate bread, they were eating everything the wheat kernel contained. Not by choice, not by philosophy, by default. The wheat kernel itself was a complete structure, 3 parts working together. The bran, the outer shell, fiber, protection, the part that gave bread its darker color and rougher texture. The germ, the embryo, the part that would sprout if planted, rich in oils, vitamins, minerals, the part that made flour spoil. The endosperm, the largest part, starch, energy, the white interior that would eventually become the only part that mattered. When these 3 parts were ground together between stones, they created flour that was alive in a sense. It had oils that could go rancid. It had enzymes that remained active. It changed over time. This made it difficult to store, difficult to ship, difficult to predict. A bag of flour in summer behaved differently than a bag of flour in winter. Flour from one harvest tasted different than flour from another. Bakers learned to adjust. They learned to feel the dough, to add more water or less, to knead longer or shorter. Bread making was a skill developed over years. It required attention. It required adaptation. The body processed this flour slowly. Digestion took time. Energy released gradually. Meals were heavier. They lasted longer in the stomach. People ate less frequently. There was no language for refined or whole grain because there was no contrast. There was only flour. This was not a better time. It was simply a different set of conditions. Flour spoiled. Flour required labor. Flour was inconsistent. Stone mills were slow. They required constant maintenance. The stones wore down and needed to be recarved. The process was expensive. For large cities, for growing populations, for a country expanding westward, this system had limits that would soon be tested. And for the people living with it, these limitations were not a problem to solve. It was just how things were, until the machinery improved. In 1870, a new kind of mill arrived in the United States. It came from Hungary. It used rollers instead of stones. The roller mill could do something stone mills could not. It could separate. It could strip away the bran. It could remove the germ. It could isolate the endosperm, the white, starchy center of the wheat kernel. What remained was a fine, white powder. It was smooth. It was light. It was beautiful. And it didn't spoil. The oils in wheat, the part that went rancid, were in the germ. Once the germ was removed, flour could sit on a shelf for months, for years. This solved an enormous problem. In a rapidly industrializing country, food needed to travel. It needed to be shipped by rail, stored in warehouses, sold in cities far from where it was grown. Perishable flour couldn't do that. Refined flour could. The roller mills were faster too. They could process more wheat in less time. They required less labor. They were more profitable. The technology was elegant. Steel rollers, spinning at different speeds, could crack the wheat kernel and separate its parts through a series of sieves and air currents. First, the bran was removed, then the germ. What passed through to the end was pure endosperm. This endosperm could then be ground into powder as fine as snow. The result was transformative. Flour that was uniform, flour that was shelf-stable, flour that could be branded, packaged, and sold nationwide. By the 1880s, roller mills were being built across the country. By the 1900s, they had replaced nearly every stone mill. This was not a conspiracy. This was progress. Mill owners saw opportunity. They invested in the new technology. They advertised their product as superior. And in many measurable ways, it was. The flour was whiter. The bread was softer. The texture was finer. Consumers preferred it. Bakers preferred it. It rose higher. It stayed fresh longer. It felt cleaner. White flour became associated with purity, with modernity, with refinement. Darker flour, the kind that still contained bran and germ, became associated with poverty, with roughness, with the past. In Europe, white bread had long been the bread of the wealthy. The aristocracy ate white bread. The peasants ate dark bread. This association carried over. White became aspirational. When immigrant families came to America, one of the markers of success was being able to afford white bread. It meant you had made it. You were no longer eating the coarse, heavy bread of the old country. This was not imposed. This was chosen, again and again, by millions of people. The decision to refine flour was not made in a single room by a single person. It was made by market forces, by technology, by convenience, by desire. And it made sense. Why would anyone choose flour that spoiled when they could have flour that didn't? Why would anyone choose dense, heavy bread when they could have light, soft bread? Why would anyone choose inconsistency when they could have uniformity? There was no reason to resist. And so, almost no one did. Doctors at the time did not object. Nutritional science was in its infancy. Vitamins had not yet been discovered. The idea that food contained invisible essential compounds was not yet understood. All anyone knew was that white flour worked. It baked well. It tasted good. It kept. By 1910, refined white flour was the standard. It was what flour meant. Everything else was a variation, an exception, a relic. The bran and germ that had been removed, they became animal feed. They were considered waste, byproducts. The most nutritious parts of the wheat kernel were being fed to livestock. And nobody thought this was strange, because the goal was never nutrition. The goal was efficiency, and efficiency had been achieved. The change didn't feel like a change. It felt like improvement. Bread became softer, lighter, easier to chew, easier to digest, or so it seemed. Mothers bought white flour because it was what the store sold. Bakers used white flour because it was what customers wanted. Within a generation, the memory of stone-ground flour faded. Children growing up in the 1920s and 1930s had no reference point. White bread was bread, that was all. The marketing reflected this. Advertisements didn't argue for white flour, they simply assumed it. Pure, clean, modern. These weren't lies, they were associations, and associations repeated often enough become truth. Flour companies created brands. They created mascots. They created loyalty. Pillsbury, Gold Medal, King Arthur. These names became trusted, familiar, comforting. When a woman reached for flour in a store, she reached for the brand her mother had used, or the brand advertised in the magazines she read. The choice felt personal, but it was shaped by forces far beyond the kitchen. By the 1930s, bread was being sold pre-sliced, pre-packaged, uniform. Wonder Bread launched in 1930, sliced, wrapped, soft. It became iconic. It became American. Bread that lasted a week, bread that didn't crumble, bread that felt the same in every city, in every state. This was not sinister, this was convenience. And convenience, once experienced, is very hard to give up. The body adjusted, meals adjusted, routines adjusted. Bread became lighter in the stomach. It became easier to eat more of it. It became a neutral base, something to put things on, rather than something to eat on its own. Sandwiches became common, quick lunches, portable meals. In previous generations, bread was eaten with meals. Now it was the meal. The act of chewing changed. The time spent eating changed. Soft bread required less chewing, less saliva, less time. Meals became faster, more efficient. Nobody noticed, or if they did, they didn't say. Because what would they compare it to? The few grandmothers who remembered stone-ground flour were not writing articles. They were not leading movements. They were simply getting older. And their children had no interest in going backward. Why would they? Life was improving in so many ways. Cars, electricity, telephones, indoor plumbing. Soft white bread fit perfectly into this vision of progress. By the 1950s, white bread was so normal that it became invisible. It was what children ate for lunch, what families toasted for breakfast, what restaurants served with dinner. It was cheap. It was everywhere. It was expected. The few people who still made bread from whole wheat flour were seen as eccentric, health-focused, maybe a little extreme. The health food movement existed, but it was fringe. It was associated with sanitariums, with Seventh-day Adventists, with people who had unusual ideas about the body. Mainstream America ate white bread, and mainstream America saw nothing wrong with that. This is how normalization works. Not through force, through repetition. Through the slow, quiet process of forgetting there was ever an alternative. Through the accumulation of small choices that over time become culture. By the 1960s, even the language had changed. Whole wheat was now a modifier, a special category. The default needed no label. It was just bread, just flour. White had become so standard that it was invisible. The human body evolved eating wheat kernels, whole, intact, complete. For thousands of years, humans ground grain and ate everything the grain contained. The body learned to process this. The digestive system adapted to it. It did not evolve eating isolated starch. When the bran and germ were removed, something else was removed too. Fiber, vitamins, minerals, fats. What remained was pure carbohydrate, quick energy, fast absorption. The body processed this differently. Refined flour entered the bloodstream faster. It spiked blood sugar higher. It left the stomach sooner. This wasn't immediately obvious. It didn't cause pain. It didn't trigger alarm. It simply changed the rhythm of eating. People got hungry faster. They ate more frequently. They needed more food to feel full. The satiety that came from fiber, from bulk, from slow digestion, was gone. What replaced it was quick energy, followed by quick depletion. Over decades, this had effects. In the early 1900s, obesity was rare, diabetes was rare, heart disease was less common. By the mid-1900s, all three were rising. This was not caused by flour alone, but flour was part of it. Refined carbohydrates, white flour, white sugar, white rice, became the foundation of the modern diet. Bread, pasta, pastries, crackers, cereal, cookies, cakes. All of it made from flour that had been stripped of everything but starch. The body adapted, but adaptation is not the same as thriving. Energy levels changed. People experienced crashes, fatigue, cravings. The solution often was to eat more, to eat again. This cycle became normal. Coffee and donuts in the morning, sandwich at lunch, pasta for dinner, cookies before bed. Each meal built on refined flour, each meal spiking blood sugar, each meal followed by a drop. The body was being asked to manage something it had never encountered in evolutionary history: constant, rapid glucose absorption. Insulin levels rose, then rose again, then stayed elevated. The pancreas worked harder. The cells became less responsive. This took years to develop, decades. By the time symptoms appeared, the pattern was deeply established. By the 1970s, doctors began noticing patterns: rising rates of metabolic disease, rising rates of digestive issues, rising rates of inflammation. Some researchers pointed to refined flour, others pointed to sugar, others pointed to fat. The conversation became complicated, contradictory, confusing. Studies were funded, results were published, recommendations were made. But the recommendations kept changing. One decade, fat was the enemy. Another decade, carbs were the enemy. Another decade, it was calories. Meanwhile, people kept eating, because what else would they do? The bread was cheap. The bread was everywhere. The bread was what they knew. And for most people, the connection between what they ate and how they felt was not obvious. It unfolded over years, over decades, over lifetimes. By the time the body showed symptoms, the cause was invisible, because the cause was normal. A body raised on refined flour was different from a body raised on whole grain, not dramatically, not visibly, but in small ways. In the way blood sugar responded, in the way the gut microbiome developed, in the way inflammation accumulated. These differences were subtle. They didn't appear in childhood, they appeared in middle age, and by then they were attributed to aging, to genetics, to bad luck, not to the bread. Never to the bread. Most of these changes didn't feel like decisions. They felt like progress. Flour became whiter, bread became softer, life became easier. And in many ways, it was. But ease has a cost, and that cost is often paid slowly, over years, over bodies, over generations. The people who made the decision to refine flour were not villains. They were solving real problems. The people who bought refined flour were not foolish. They were choosing what seemed better. And the people who ate it were simply living their lives. But somewhere in that process, something was lost. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just quietly. If this way of seeing history resonates, this channel may feel familiar to you. In the 1940s, the US government began mandating that refined flour be enriched. Vitamins were added back, iron was added back. Some of what had been removed was returned. This was presented as a solution, and in some ways, it was. Diseases caused by vitamin deficiencies, like pellagra and beriberi, became less common. But enrichment is not the same as wholeness. You can add nutrients to flour. You cannot add back fiber. You cannot add back the oils. You cannot recreate the structure of the original grain. The bread made from enriched flour was still soft, still white, still fast digesting. It was still refined. And by then, refined was normal. The enrichment program was a response to a problem that had been created by refinement in the first place. The solution was not to return to whole grain flour. It was to make refined flour slightly less deficient. This satisfied the immediate concern, but it didn't address the deeper change. The change in how the body processed food, the change in satiety, the change in blood sugar, the change in the gut. Those changes remained. Today, whole wheat flour exists. It's available. It's sold in every grocery store. But it's not the default, it's the alternative. Walk down the bread aisle. Most of what you see is made from refined flour. White bread. Wheat bread that's mostly white flour with a little whole wheat added for color. Artisanal bread. Sourdough. Baguettes. All refined. Whole grain bread exists, but it's labeled. It's marked as different. And it's often more expensive. The default is still white flour, still refined, still stripped. Most people don't think about this. They don't need to. The bread works. It tastes fine. It fits into life. But underneath that normalcy is a decision that was made over a century ago. A decision that nobody voted on, nobody debated, nobody questioned. A decision that made sense at the time. And a decision that quietly reshaped the human body. This is not about blame, it's not about guilt, it's not about going back. It's about noticing. Noticing that the food we eat today is not the food humans ate for most of history. Noticing that efficiency often comes with trade-offs. noticing that what feels normal is often just what we've grown used to. Flour stopped being food in the sense that food once meant over 100 years ago. And most of us never noticed, because by the time we were born, it was already normal. The bread in our kitchens, the pasta in our pantries, the crackers in our lunchboxes, all of it built on a foundation of refined flour, a product designed not for the body, but for the supply chain, not for nutrition, but for shelf life, not for health, but for profit. And none of that required conspiracy. It only required incentives. Incentives that made perfect sense at the time, and that continue to make sense today. Because changing would be expensive, inconvenient, disruptive. And so, the system continues. The flour continues to be refined, the bread continues to be soft, the body continues to adapt, and most people continue not to notice. This wasn't the last decision of its kind.